morning and welcome to Skipton Baptist Church Online. So far in this series, Encounter Meeting Jesus, that we've been looking at over the past few weeks, we've come across a number of individuals who meet with Jesus and have their lives impacted by this encounter. We've had the Samaritan woman at the well, Zacchaeus, we've had Nicodemus, and we've had the woman who anointed Jesus at Bethany. Now, we'll be continuing this series throughout and beyond Easter, but this week, as we journey into Holy Week towards Good Friday and towards Easter Sunday, the encounter with Jesus this week we're looking at is not an individual or even a small group. This is an encounter with Jesus made by crowds of people called on the day that we refer to as Palm Sunday. And these crowds of people are from different backgrounds, races, social levels, and religious experience. They all in some way or another feel they know who Jesus is when they really don't. And this encounter with Jesus creates a definite impact and sets off a chain of events which culminate in what happens on Good Friday and Easter Sunday and beyond. Now, perhaps you've come across this phrase, if you know, you know. Maybe some people have said that to you, but I certainly have seen it sporadically on social media. And it usually involves a phrase or a situation, a photo or an image with this enigmatic phrase, if you know, you know. And apart from it being a really odd saying, because obviously if you do know, you do know, it's actually used to convey that only certain people will see and understand a hidden meaning or message which most other observers are oblivious to. I don't know if you've ever experienced it or even used it, but it communicates that there is something more that's going on, and only some people in the know will see it. It's really exclusivist, and it often winds me up. If you know, you know. We probably all know the story of the events of Palm Sunday. Jesus on a donkey riding into Jerusalem, and the crowd celebrate his arrival by picking up whatever's nearby to wave in jubilation or to throw on the floor as his pavement. We know it, don't we? But there's so much more going on here than what is seen on the surface. The other night I was watching a movie with my son Owen, and it was called Inception. Now, this is a sci-fi mystery heist thriller set in people's dreams. Now, when I say that, at one point in the story, it's actually a dream within a dream, within a dream, within a dream, and it is proper confusing. But it reminded me that in this story, which is so important, this story of what we call Palm Sunday is so important that it appears in all four Gospels, that there are multiple levels of meaning happening all the time, layer upon layer upon layer, digging down to ultimately what the truth is. And so we are going to start digging. The first thing which covers all that we're looking at in these events is that Jesus knew what he was doing, and he knew the impact his actions would have. It's interesting to note that this entry into Jerusalem didn't start at the beginning of our reading, and if it's Matthew in 21 verse 1. As Jesus comes to the area of Bethany and Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, his journey actually started a bit further back. We read in Luke 9:51, not long after the events of Peter proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah and the Transfiguration, not long after it says, as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Resolutely means to secure his eyes on a destination or target. He knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he was going to do. He even warned his closest friends what was going to happen, and they either don't seem to get it or they don't choose to accept it. If they knew, they really didn't know. Apart from the fact it's clear, Mark 10, that they knew it was risky, they knew it was dangerous. It says the disciples knew that the disciples were afraid as Jesus was leading the way to Jerusalem. They knew what was going on in that sense. But Jesus knew what he was doing throughout all of this. And he knew he was on a course which would lead to significant confrontation with Rome and power in itself, with Jewish religious leaders, and with the people and their understanding and expectations. And the story revolves around two things. The first is the triumph The second is the temple. So the triumph is what we call this incident when Jesus walks or parades into Jerusalem. It's the triumphal entry. Jesus enters on a donkey, heralded by throngs of people waving branches and singing, and he's acting like he's already won. What is going on? Well, remember that this was not Palm Sunday to those who were there. It was the first day of the week that was leading up to the most important festival in the Jewish calendar, Passover. The place would have been heaving from people all over the city, all over the nation, gathering to celebrate and to remember. To remember the time God delivered Israel out of slavery, out of Egypt, and brought them into their own land to be their own nation. Now, it's useful to keep that in mind because that's the cause of the excitement and the celebration, but it also provides the undercurrent of simmering tension. Israel is no longer its own nation. It's still under oppression. This time it's Rome who's in charge. That is abundantly clear by the legions of soldiers around. The people are still in a form of slavery, even while celebrating the festival of their freedom. And because of this, the situation is like a tinderbox of rebellion and uprising. It's in the air, hence why it seems that there's more Roman troops on the streets than usual. And in the midst of this, Jesus does something incredibly incendiary. He rides into the city on a donkey. Now, it seems innocuous on one level, but something more is happening here. If you know, you know. Now, I've spoken before about how Jesus would often use humor in his teaching, but here's a real example of satire. Well before any BBC Two stand-up comedian took to the stage, Jesus, in a real sense, is poking fun, mocking the Roman triumph. Now, a Roman triumph is not an old-style car. This is the typical victory parade which would accompany a returning general, governor, or emperor on their return from a victorious campaign into the city. It was a statement of power, of victory, of don't mess with me. In fact, Pilate may well have had something akin to this procession as he took up residence in Jerusalem at this time from his residence in Caesarea on the coast. But what is Jesus doing here? Riding on a donkey. Well, actually, that isn't as silly a thing as we might think. If he'd ridden just a donkey, a standard form of travel at the time, it would have looked normal. What Jesus actually does is he rides the colt of a donkey into the city. The image wouldn't have been lost on those watching. Jesus is not just making some kind of political pun at the expense of Rome. He's holding up a mocking mirror to the image of worldly power, ultimately seen at this time as Rome. Jesus is kind of poking fun because Psalm 118 kind of pokes fun at this whole glory of fine chariots and horses. Actually, in God's power, you might as well be on a miniature donkey's colt with peasants' coats and palm branches and sheaves as the mighty parade ground. But there is something more going on than mere political, topical satire at the expense of Rome. If you know, you know. And the people thought they knew. Jesus is enacting a centuries-old prophecy. In fact, there's so much Old Testament prophecy happening in these events, it's hard to keep up. But here we are in Zechariah chapter 9. Rejoice greatly, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous, victorious, lowly, riding on the colt of a donkey. The whole chapter of Zechariah was written when the people of God had returned from exile, had rebuilt the temple, the city, but their new golden age had not happened. They were still under the cosh of powerful military neighbors. And this whole chapter in Zechariah 9 talks of the day when the king would ride into Jerusalem to inaugurate his kingdom, which would be seen by him on a donkey. It speaks of him ruling from sea to sea, of rescuing those imprisoned. And when Jesus orders and arranges it and sits on this colt of a donkey, he knows exactly what he is doing and how people would see it. Their minds would recall the prophecy of the arrival of the king, and Jesus doing it at this time of Passover in this place in Jerusalem is incredibly provocative and incendiary. And the people are moved by what Jesus does, and their response reveals what they see happening, and they respond decidedly. They cut off palm branches, spread them on the road, and wave them in the air. Think of Isaiah 40 verse 3, prepare the way of the Lord. And palm branches were an associate symbol of Israel, like the oak tree is for England, that kind of idea. Palm branches were used in the Feast of Tabernacles when they built shelters, remembering when Israel were freed from Egypt and were in the wilderness. And the palm branch was a symbol of Judah Maccabees, that Jewish national hero that we touched upon when we looked at Daniel, who overthrew the Greeks and established a free Jewish kingdom until the Romans turned up. It's a potent symbol, and so they wave their symbols and they sing their songs. The song is the words of Psalm 118. At this time of year especially, we're so familiar with those words. Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna, it's entered our kind of cultural Christian lexicon, hasn't it? We see it as a word of celebration, of songs of celebration. What we might miss is that Psalm 118 is actually a rebel song. Now, I grew up in Ireland, as you know, and there's a long history of conflict and division, Catholics and Protestants, Ireland, Britain. Each side had their own sayings, slogans, symbols, and songs. And whenever I go and watch Ireland play rugby, one of the songs we sing on the terraces is a song called The Fields of Athenry. It's a lilting Irish country ballad, but it's actually, when it was written, it was a song of sedition and rebellion. And this is what we see within the Psalm 118, especially in this context. Hosanna is not some kind of celebratory yippee. Hosanna is a prayer. Save us, it means. Save us, Son of David. It's a cry to God to rescue them. The Son of David, he is our King. Rescue us, because Caesar is not our Lord. You see, Psalm 118 is all about God's victory over his enemies and the triumphant parade into the city. And as far as Rome is concerned, that would be rebellion. But maybe they didn't understand the words. Maybe they didn't get it. If they knew, they didn't really know. They just saw a peasant on a donkey. There's no threat there. Waving branches, no threat there. The people are heralding Jesus as their king. And the words of Zechariah 9:9 resonate across the years. Here is your king riding on a donkey. They knew what Jesus was communicating to them. I am your king. I am your Messiah. The Jewish religious leaders knew what was going on, and they were worried. The teacher, this alleged miracle worker who'd been challenging their traditions, was now rousing the people under his messianic banner to rise up. It would only bring trouble for the nation, for them. Rome will crush us. He must be stopped. But Jesus knew what he was doing. He knew the prophecies. He knew the people's hopes and expectations, and he knew his actions were prodding the hornet's nest. This was dangerous. In riding into Jerusalem like this, receiving the words and adulation of the crowd and accepting the title of King and Messiah. You see, it's a bit like when it comes to an election, like in the US or the prime minister elections. A person standing for that office often has an event where they announce their candidacy. And it's usually a symbolic or special significant place or time. This is Jesus kind of similarly announcing who he is. So often in the Gospels, people have asked him to say plainly, are you the Messiah? And Jesus would dodge the question, would get them challenged in a different way. He would hide away when people wanted to make him king at the wrong time in the wrong way. In John 6, it says that people wanted to make him king by force. So Jesus hid away, but he's not hiding now. Here is Jesus at the most important, significant place, Jerusalem, at the most important and significant time of year, Passover, declaring he is the Messiah. He is the King. Rome wouldn't be happy. The religious authorities and the temple rulers wouldn't be happy, but the people love it. Here is our King at Passover, poking fun at the Romans, fulfilling the prophecies of the Messiah. This is our time, and here is our King. Until Jesus changes direction. until Jesus goes an unexpected way. Whilst the triumph was a confrontation with Rome, actually more revealing of the shallowness of power in this world, and whilst heralding of Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah would have wound up the religious leaders who are in opposition, something else is going on here. I wish the physical geography would allow it, but use your imagination. The road that Jesus is on the donkey, enters into Jerusalem. Jesus on this donkey, the crowd going wild. He comes to a metaphorical T-junction, and one direction leads to the Praetorium, the place of the legions, the palace of the governor where Pilate was, the symbol and place of Roman dominion and control. Instead, Jesus takes the other road towards the temple. Perhaps the crowd were expecting him to turn towards the Praetorium, to lead the masses in uprising, to overthrow their oppressors, to herald in the new dawn of the new kingdom of Israel, but instead Jesus takes a different turn. He goes towards the temple, the beating heart of Judaism and its national identity. Why is he doing this? They're saying, Jesus, you're going the wrong way. We want you to go this way. We want you to go our way. And Jesus comes to the temple, and things become even more confrontational there. Now, there are differing accounts of these events in the Gospels. John has this account at the start of Jesus' ministry, and no, I don't think it means Jesus ransacked the temple courts twice. John's Gospel is not a chronological retelling of Jesus' story, but a theological one. He's communicating a different message in this placing of events. Matthew and Luke have very similar accounts, whereas Mark's account has Jesus, after the triumphal entry, going into the temple courts, looking around, then going out, and then coming back the next day and playing havoc. Now, the timing in one sense doesn't matter, but what this indicates and suggests again is Jesus knows exactly what he's doing here. He would have been at the temple many times over the years. It was no surprise to him to see the marketeers in the temple courts. But timing is everything, and this was his time, as he confronts, provokes, prods, and challenges the temple practices. Jesus upturns the tables and benches of the money changers and the dove sellers. Now, this always makes me think of those times, I don't know if you've ever experienced it, where someone snidely remarks to a Christian, if they don't like their behavior, they say, well, that's not very Jesus-like, is it? And I'd love to reply sometime that remind them that being like Jesus also has the provision of ransacking a market and kicking people out of his house. That's not necessarily the right approach. But this is not Jesus being shocked and having some kind of knee-jerk reaction. This is an outpouring of righteous anger. An outpouring and an anger which is rightly only belongs to the one who owns the place, who owns the temple. Otherwise, Jesus has no right saying and doing what he does. It's written, he says, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. He's quoting from Isaiah 56 and from Jeremiah 7. What is Jesus doing here? The people are thinking, we thought you were on our side. Shouldn't be doing this up at the Romans part of the city? Three aspects of this holy rage. The first thing, the money changers, Lady Turf's out. Now, when we go on holiday, we often need to sort out foreign currency, don't we? Not everywhere takes pounds sterling. And there's always that usual finding out the best exchange rate for the best price, with or without commission, etc., etc. And something similar happens at the temple. Purchases of sanctified offerings could only be bought in the temple courts using sanctified money, the temple shekel. You couldn't use your local and possibly pagan shekels and drachmas or unclean cash. Safe to say there was always a hefty commission in this money exchange. And so Jesus overturns the money tables and kicks them out. The dove sellers that he turfs out as well, what have they done? Why single them out? Well, doves were the items that were bought as offerings to God if you couldn't afford a bigger offering. In other words, these were the people who were taking advantage of the poor. And where this happens is another aspect that makes all this marketeering and happening in the outer courts. This place that happens is the court where the Gentiles and the women were allowed to go and no further. It's hence why the reference Jesus uses from Isaiah 56 is, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." This is not an exclusively just Jewish enclave. It's a house of prayer for all nations. The people are welcome. The poor, the Gentile were coming to worship at the temple of God, and the authorities were placing unnecessary barriers, making it difficult for them. They were filling up their space that should be used for worship, and they were doing money-making opportunities and taking advantage of the poor. So Jesus kicks them out of his house. And look who replaces them. Look who come to Jesus in their place. In Matthew 21, 14 and 15, the blind and the lame came to him, and he healed them. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law get really annoyed when the children are in the temple courts shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Maybe the children seem to know something, The blind, the lame, the children were now there, those who had previously been excluded. And Jesus' words and his actions are blowing the minds of the crowd. We've been heralding him as our king. We were ready to rise up with him, but we've no idea what he's up to. It's like he's picking a fight with his own people. There's confusion, disillusionment, even anger. Now, I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that there's every possibility that members of the cheering crowd on Sunday could quite easily become the jeering crowd on Friday, demanding Jesus' execution. Such was the extent of the letdown, the disappointment. Now, I've spoken about this concept of being disappointed with Jesus before. It's one I've heard from people who have followed Jesus, who at some point in their life has left them feeling hurt and disillusioned. Two things I've noticed that is quite common. First, that those who are disappointed with Jesus are usually more often disappointed by his people, by us. The church has let people down, hurt and damaged, especially when we have acted less than Jesus-like. And when these things happen, Jesus gets the blame. What a challenge, eh? But so often too, we all, if we're honest, may have times of apparent disappointment with Jesus. Certainly what I've seen and what is apparent in these events on Palm Sunday is that it's not that Jesus was wrong or leading us in the wrong path, but our expectations, our hopes, our presumptions, and our demands are often what are wrong and often lead to their disappointment. The Hosanna crowd proclaimed and declared that Jesus was their king, but they are discovering that he wasn't the king they thought he was or that they wanted. Jesus here is confounding and disappointing their expectations. So we have the triumph and the temple. These events on Palm Sunday, we know the story, eh? The triumphal entry, the cleansing of the temple, but there is more going on than just these mere actions of Jesus. There is meaning. He knows what he is doing. The Romans saw what was happening, but they didn't know what the actions meant. The crowd saw what was happening. They knew their scriptures, the promise, they knew what he was doing, but they didn't really know what he was doing, what it really meant. The authorities saw what Jesus was doing, and they knew what it meant, possible uprising, possible turmoil, so it must be squashed. And so they looked for a way to get rid of Jesus. They all thought they knew what was going on, but only Jesus did. Zechariah's prophecy revealed, and Jesus enacted it to show that he is the king, the anointed one, the Messiah. And the crowd responded with their rebel songs. Psalm 118, Hosanna, save us. With boughs of palms in their hands, according to Psalm 118, they join the festal procession. They thought they knew, but they didn't. They should have read further on in the psalm. Because where does this festival procession lead to? Where does it end up in Psalm 118? Well, it says here, with boughs in hands, join the festival procession up to the horns of the altar. The horns of the altar? It's interesting that another way of translating the festal procession is this: bind the festal sacrifice with ropes and take it to the horns of the altar. The procession in Psalm 118 culminates not with power, but with obedience, with sacrifice. The horns of the altar were the actual corner points of the sacrificial altar where the priests would place the blood of the sacrificed lamb. You see, the triumph procession of the Messiah does not end on a throne, but on a cross at the place of sacrifice. It's where the procession ends up in Psalm 118, where Jesus ends up on a Roman cross several days later. Now, it may be poetic or prophetic, but we take Zechariah 9:9 about Jesus the King riding on a donkey. We add Psalm 118 in the light of what Jesus does, the time of year and the place. And this shows a demonstration of a different sort of kingdom and a very different sort of king. Jesus confronts Rome, but actually he's confronting the idea of power, of majesty and authority. He's confronting the authorities who have misunderstood him and were looking for a way to get rid of him. And this demonstration at the temple was a great reason to try it. Jesus knew what he was doing. Jesus is confronting the people, those who are desperate for a deliverer, to kick out the Romans and reestablish the kingdom of Israel. He's confronting their idea of their king. He's confronting not just people, not just groups, but ideas, expectations, and presumptions. And Jesus knows what he's doing. A previous time, when we looked at the idea of Jesus being king, I asked an icebreaker question about the national anthem, whether we fully know the words. Now, since then, we now have a king. So the trivia is, God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble King. God save the King. Send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save. Is it our or is it the king? The answer is the king. Now, it may seem like a bit of disconnected trivia, but I actually wonder if this is where we land with these events and these passages. The people waving those branches and throwing their coats, calling Jesus their king. But as long as he was the king they wanted him to be, then he could be their king. And I wonder if we can fall into that trap too. That we decide that Jesus is my king, our king, but only if he's the king in the shape we decide. As in the UK, we live in a constitutional monarchy. Our monarch, the king, reigns by the will of the people. It's a democratic thing. The people dictate the power, the authority, and the limitations of the king and the parameters of his power over us. And I wonder whether we sometimes treat Jesus as our constitutional monarch, our democratic king. We will profess and confess that he is our king, but we maintain control of what that means. We make Jesus the king in the shape we want him to be. We decide his areas of authority and influence, rule and reign, how he should rule and what his parameters are. We decide the limits of his power. We choose in what areas of our lives we will obey and surrender to him. He is my king as long as he is the king I want him to be. My personal preference, own designer-made monarch. Is he? Or is he the king? The one who rules whether we agree or not. He is the king, the absolute monarch. But unfortunately, our image of what that means in this world has been damaged to lead to that as an image of domination and oppression. That's our fallen human experience. But our absolute monarch is not like those of this world. The king gives us all the choice. Do you want me to be your king? Really your king? So the challenge, I suppose, today, as we reflect on this familiar Easter time story of a donkey, some palm trees, and a sing-song crowd, is that too often, like the people in that crowd that day, we want to shape Jesus to be the king, our king. Hence, we're disappointed that he doesn't fulfill our expectations. He's not just our king, your king, their king, or my king. He is the king. And do we want to submit to the kingship of Jesus? Does the rule of Jesus and his way influence and direct every aspect of our lives? Our priorities, how we conduct ourselves, how we spend our resources, our time, money, energy, radical obedience or negotiated compromise? I clearly remember once at a conference, I've told this story before, that during a time of worship, we were reflecting on Jesus the King, and I was so overwhelmed by the Holy Spirit that Jesus was the King, really the King, that I instinctively, almost without thinking, I simply knelt on one knee before the King. I knelt before the King as his servant. So maybe this is the way we should be thinking about this. Not that Jesus is my King or our King, as if we own him or define him. Perhaps he needs to confront us with our incorrect image of who he is and what he's about, because he knows what he is doing. Do we? He is the King. We are his servants. And we follow his rule and his reign, even when, and maybe especially when, his rule confronts and conflicts with our own. For Jesus is the King.